Hi, I'm Denise.
And I'm Toni.
Welcome to the Mindfulness of Singing.
Thanks for tuning in to create a harmonious mind, body, and spirit.
Let's get started.
How we sound? Oh, yay. I'm happy to introduce our dynamic guest. We have Julia Gerard and Catherine Brown. I'll tell you about Julia first. You can find more about Julia at Julia Gerard, GERHARD, speechandvoice.com. She provides speech and voice services, as you might guess. She has in-depth training as both a speech pathologist and as a performer. She has a doctorate in vocal performance. She provides both in-person and telehealth services throughout Florida and dynamic background. And she's partnered with another person with a dynamic background, and together they've got some really cool research they've done. And so her partner in crime is Catherine Brown, and you can find her at catherinebrown.com. Catherine teaches mindfulness meditation to people with voice disorders. She is a trained mindfulness teacher. She's an experienced singer, and I think really importantly for this is she also comes from a perspective of having to deal with several voice disorders herself, and she speaks freely about that. So thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for both of you for sharing all of your rich, extensive background, and they've done some amazing research, and that's why we wanted to have you on today to share all of that. So I don't know who wants to kick it off first, but that's our dynamic duo. So tell us about your research.
So I'll get started because it was my research project that connected Julia and I, which was wonderful. Um, so, like you said, I'm a singing voice teacher with several voice disorders. I was diagnosed with vocal fold paresis twice. I had it in high school. It went undiagnosed for 10 years. I got a diagnosis. I went through treatment. It was really successful. Treatment just being voice therapy. And at that time, I also took a mindfulness class, and I not only had vocal fold paresis, which was caused by the flu, but I was also qualified for the muscle tension dysphonia diagnosis because I'd built up a lot of tension in my throat to try to compensate for the weakness in my vocal cords. And so when I was going through my rehab, I ended up taking a mindfulness course because I just started realizing how much tension there was in my body, started becoming aware of all that. And I saw a flyer for a mindfulness course and I thought, you know what? This could really help me. And it really, really did. It gave me an awareness of my body that was new for me. And that the same thing was also happening in my voice therapy that I was going through. So it ended up being a really great experience for me. And then I ended up about 10 years later getting sick with the flu when I was pregnant and was diagnosed with vocal fold paresis again. So the first one was just the left vocal cord. Now it's bilateral. Um, and so at that point, I stopped performing. But I wanted to know if mindfulness would be helpful to other people with voice disorders. And so I wanted to become a mindfulness teacher. And I also wanted to be able to research whether mindfulness could be helpful because I had this my own experience and I had a lot of reasons to think it would be helpful, but no one had studied it. At that point, there was literally not a single study on mindfulness and voice. Um, and so I enrolled in a program at Westchester University that allows you get trained in mindfulness, and then you're allowed to run an IRB approved study. So that's what I did, and I sent out an email recruiting. I wanted to recruit singers, but also anyone with a voice disorder, not just singers. Singers with voice disorders and anyone else with a voice disorder. And Julia was one of the professionals who I reached out to, and when you send out an email to like 400 busy professionals, you might get like 5 responses, and most of them are audit reminders that someone's on vacation. And Julia emailed me and said, "We need to talk." And so
Mhm.
so we talked, and we've been talking ever since. Because well, I'll let Julia tell you her
Yeah,
story.
because I was a voice therapist. First, I was a singer, and got interested in voice therapy. A friend of mine was doing some voice therapy in Philadelphia during our master's program. And when I started finding out that this was a profession to work with people, as a person who can help them get through a voice disorder, I thought that was phenomenal. I also thought that was really normal in the field of speech therapy, and it's actually a very, very, very small subset of the speech pathologists who do that. And so when I was applying for DMA programs, I applied to speech pathology programs in case that didn't work out, But as soon as I started the hearing science course of all things, I was hooked. So once I did decide to go the route of speech pathology, then I did end up getting into a DMA program, and I just did them together. So I was very happily doing this. I thought it was the best thing since sliced bread. I love it. I love every minute of it. After my third child, I had a very serious injury that just sidelined me. I couldn't work. It was a nerve entrapment injury. And, it involved a lot of stressful things. Like I couldn't breastfeed my baby. I couldn't drive my car. I couldn't work with the other two. And it was, right after the pandemic started. So couldn't even really get help. And the doctor who finally ended up helping me a couple months in, because it takes a while to get these things diagnosed, said, my patients who do best do mindfulness. And I did not listen to her because that's typically what people do. The last thing I wanted to do was stop my mind and be mindful, because it was very hard to be in that situation. And I really didn't want to pay attention to it in any way that mindfulness kind of calls you to. So finally, I was having a conversation with a very good friend, and I said, I have had a lot of terrible things happen to me. And she called me out of the blue after like 10 years, So it was the pandemic. She must have been bored. She called me. And I said, I need to hear something good. What's the best thing in your life? And she said, meditation. And I was like, what? And she told me about loving kindness meditation, which I'd never heard about. She said she does it every day for 45 minutes. In fact, she had done it right before she called me because she wanted to be in a really good mindset. And I truly love this person and always have. And so I also think she's one of the most intelligent people I know. So I said, I'm going to try it. And she gave me the name of Nikki Malgafori. She gave me an intro class by Sharon Salzberg, and it is what started my path to recovery.
Wow.
And I've been meditating almost daily ever since then.
Mhm.
And when I was able to go back to work, because I had stopped working full time for voice right before I had my second child, and I went back about a year after my third child. So there was some time there. I went back, and it was like I was doing a different job. The job was exactly the same. I mean, it was online, but otherwise I was seeing patients for voice therapy in the same clinic with the same doctors, everything. But it was like I was doing a different job because I could not take the mindfulness out of my work. I couldn't take it out of my life. I couldn't take it out of my viewpoint, and I couldn't take it out of my relationships and the way that I was functioning. And so I started using it in therapy, and I started seeing that it was so helpful for other patients. I was using indirect mindfulness where I was just being mindful. I was pointing out things. I was asking patients to try certain types of meditation on their own and get back to me. So I was more or less kind of experimenting. And then I got Catherine's email, and I said, we need to talk. And so that's kind of where she left off.
Yeah, and both Julia and I had both done lit reviews to try to just figure out what was already out there in the scientific literature and the voice singing literature about mindfulness. And there's so much out there that says you need to reduce stress, you need to practice mindfulness or yoga, and yet there was no actual evidence of how these things work for people. And so that's kind of what we wanted to change. Well, that's what I wanted to change, and Julia obviously wanted to work on that as well. So I'll tell you a little bit about my study. And then Julie and I can also talk more about how we've sort of since then kind of applied some of these things to our work. But my study, we had, I believe it was 30 people in a control group, and then 39 who did the mindfulness course. And it was a combination of a lot of different types of voice disorders. And they went through this 8-week mindfulness course together. And we, it's kind of, if I don't know how familiar you are with the format of an 8-week mindfulness course, but it's a very specific kind of format established by Jon Kabat-Zinn, and it's been researched in a lot of different medical contexts or clinical contexts, but again, never in voice. So you go through these 8 weeks and you introduce a different exercise each week, you incorporate some yoga into it. And then the really the part that makes it very different from meditating on your own is the group dynamic. And so, the teacher's job is to kind of guide people when they reach, when they have questions or when they kind of struggle with an exercise, but it's also to just generate discussion about how mindfulness is affecting their life. But there ends up being a lot of talk about what other things people are struggling with, because that comes up when you meditate, right? And so for these groups of people with voice disorders, it was really emotional for them to talk about their voice, and to talk about their voice with people who understood. A lot of them have, friends and family members who don't have voice disorders, and most people who get diagnosed with a voice disorder don't know anyone else who has one. And we know as singers that singers often don't talk about voice disorders because they're afraid of stigma. And so it was really, it was very emotional for them to talk to each other, and emotional in a good way, but also emotional in a hard way. It brings up, mindfulness brings up hard feelings. But the great thing about the group dynamic is it gives people a chance to talk about those feelings in a very supportive environment. And one of the things I was always reminding my students was, this is not a voice disorder support group. It is a supportive group for people with voice disorders, but the goal of the group is to learn tools together that can help us respond to the voice disorder differently. And so that's kind of the distinction I make, because it really is about those tools and how powerful they can be. And so the results of the study were really interesting. What we expected, we had people take certain tests, and what we before and after the 8-week course. And what we expected is that their mindfulness scores would go up, their perceived stress scores would go down. We hoped, of course, that their vocal handicap index scores would also go down. And then about half the participants were also singers, so they took the singing voice handicap index.
And can you just describe what the singing handicap and what the voice handicap
Yes.
is? Yeah.
So for those who kind of live in the field of speech language pathology, everyone knows it and just calls it the VHI. But for those who don't know it, the singing voice handicap index, or the voice handicap index, I'll talk about that one, because the singing voice is basically the same thing, just kind of tweaked for singers. But the voice handicap index kind of measures 3 different aspects of the voice disorder. It measures how the voice, what the physical symptoms of the voice disorder are, how the voice functions in everyday life. Things like, do I have to repeat myself a lot? Or am people always asking me to talk louder? And then there's an emotional component. How do you feel emotionally about your voice? Are you embarrassed by your voice? Are you, do you feel anxious to talk because of the sound of your voice? That kind of thing. And those pieces are actually really, really important. It's funny, we had one person who, she had some pretty severe symptoms, but it didn't bother her emotionally. And then you have other people whose symptoms are fairly mild, especially singers. They may speak perfectly normally, but they can't sing a high C anymore. And so they are extremely emotionally distressed about what would be considered a relatively mild voice disorder. And we had, people who kind of ran the gamut. The singers tend to have like really mild disorder, like, and the handicap index is divided into 3 sections: mild, moderate, and severe. So we had people near the top of the severe, and we had people near the, middle of the bottom, mild category. So it was a huge spread. But we did see people's mindfulness scores go up. We saw their stress scores go down. Although that was, when compared to the control group, that was actually not statistically significant. And I can tell you why we think that is in a minute. We saw their vocal handicap scores go down. On average, we saw an almost 11-point decrease in vocal handicap index scores. And that's a pretty big deal because on average, voice therapy results in a 13-point reduction in voice handicap. And then singing voice handicap, those scores were not statistically significant when compared to the control group. Partly that's just a numbers issue. Only about half the participants were singers, so it was a much smaller issue, a much smaller group. You need a larger group to get statistical significance often. And we some of the singers also had lived with their voice disorder for a long time. I think we might have seen more change if we'd had some more newly diagnosed singers, who are really kind of reeling emotionally from the diagnosis. We also had a lot of singers who seemed to start with a very high level of somatic awareness, as singers often do. When a singer gets diagnosed with a voice disorder, they do need an even higher level of somatic awareness, because things aren't working that they may not have. You have to pay attention to the voice in a way you never did when things worked well. And so anyway, but the singers that we had been diagnosed for a long time and seemed to have pretty high levels of somatic awareness. So there are a lot of reasons why the particular singers in our group, I think, didn't see a huge change in their singing voice handicap index. But what we still think that mindfulness could be very helpful for any singer, particularly singers with voice disorders.
And I think something important to note is that one of the stipulations in the study, which kind of had to be in order to stabilize all of the results, was that singers and anyone in the study with a voice disorder could not currently be doing voice therapy. So that meant that almost everyone in the group had been through an exhaustive course of speech therapy, sometimes multiple courses of speech therapy. So I think the mindfulness is causing the VHI to go down 11 points on its own is extremely significant, because this is not somebody who is in their first roundabout. Almost everyone in the study had already been through voice therapy.
Everyone in the study had been through voice therapy. And so what we ended up with was, we had a few singers, who were like professional level singers with mild voice disorders, but we're talking like a small handful. And then a lot of people with very severe chronic voice disorders. So people who'd been through voice therapy but hadn't gotten, full resolution of their symptoms. And so people who are, living with a chronic disorder that affects them every day. And to see mindfulness, just mindfulness, no voice therapy with it, just mindfulness, have such an impact on their voice handicap, was really, really powerful. What's interesting is that, a lot of the literature says reduce stress, reduce stress, reduce stress. It's good for your voice to reduce stress. And we completely agree with that, but we didn't see that happen in the study. People's stress scores did go down overall on average, but again, that wasn't statistically significant when compared to the control group. And we think that somatic awareness is what's playing a bigger role than stress reduction. That people's ability to notice their symptoms and then change their vocal behavior is being increased by mindful awareness. Um,
And
and
their
there
mental behavior.
Yes, and because what happens often, I mean, we know this as singers, right? You kind of get caught in a stress response and then your singing sort of spirals, right? And so I think the same thing happens to speakers with voice disorders as well, particularly, and again, a singer can have this happen on stage. If there's any negative feedback that you get from someone about your voice, or you simply hate the sound of your own voice, you're kind of going to get into a spiral as far as your technique, as far as what your body is doing. And so, we talked a lot about noticing what's happening in our bodies. We also talked a lot about just accepting what is. And that is really a fascinating thing to do with people who are used to being told to change their behavior. Any singing lesson or any voice therapy session is about changing vocal behavior, right? We tell them, oh, no, do it this way, or oh, no, do it this other way, or try this, or breathe like this. And mindfulness by nature is very non-prescriptive. It doesn't tell us how to breathe. It tells us to notice how we are already breathing, and that can then change how we breathe. And I think that particularly for people who felt they had failed voice therapy, the non-prescriptive aspect of mindfulness was really healing for them, to say, I'm just going to notice what is. And even if I absolutely abhor the tension in my neck, I'm just going to let it be there. And suddenly, when we stop hating, resisting, um, or trying to change what is, we feel shifts.
Mhm.
And they're subtle shifts, but they can be lasting shifts.
Yeah,
Although
and
we
I
didn't
think,
start
yes,
to
I
follow
think
up.
what's very exciting about this for me is that if mindfulness on its own has this impact, and I've experienced it, and I do experience it with patients, we have been studying it the past two studies, in isolation, but some research that is forthcoming in our field is finding that in much smaller, just kind of like one-time meditation or single session meditations, that the combination of mindfulness and therapy together is really where we see the biggest changes. I think that that's something that we're starting to look at in the field. And that I firmly believe is true. And so I'm very excited that we have the ability to help people to cultivate mindfulness and to provide the therapy and the, medical management, all of these things that we have to really support the whole person.
Yeah, and it was interesting in my work with these patients, a lot of them felt kind of abandoned by the medical system because, they went through their voice therapy and were basically told, we've done everything we can for you, now go live your life with this disorder that still impacts you on a daily basis. And um, giving someone something that they can do that can improve their symptoms, it empowers them in a way that that other treatments don't. And that's something that I did interviews, follow-up interviews with a lot of the participants, and that was one of the things a lot of them said, that the ability to change things themselves was so empowering when they felt helpless. And I mean, I felt that with my own, in my own situation as well.
I did too. And I think another thing that's kind of confusing to people is that mindfulness isn't very well defined um, or understood collectively by us as a culture. There's a lot of different, we see the word everywhere, mindfulness, meditation, And some people might think that's trying to be enlightened. Some people might think that's doing 5 minutes on an app. Like it's very unclear. The definition that we look at, Catherine and I, is the John Kabat-Zinn definition, paying attention on purpose in the present moment without judgment. And where that starts, when we really look at the people who systematically teach and study mindfulness, is almost without exception that I can think of in the body. And that was totally not what I expected when I started mindfulness. What, just try to relax my shoulders and do it, for while breathing for however many minutes. And if my mind wanders, then when I come back, I kind of take note of where it went to see if, that might help me sort some things out. But like that was fun when I was taught that way. And this friend that I told you about initially, she told me that I should go to a teacher, pay money to a teacher to learn mindfulness. I didn't even want to do mindfulness, mind you, and I said, I don't, what? Why? And she said, well, would you tell somebody to learn how to be a very good, skilled singer without individual voice lessons? And I was like, all right, I'll go to the teacher, because that made sense to me. But otherwise, I would, if she hadn't said that, I don't know, I would have thought it was worth it to seek out a teacher. Meanwhile, I had tried to meditate a gazillion times before, and I'd look at the flower for 5 minutes and then go, this isn't for me.
Yeah, and this is definitely something I see in my group classes as well, that, people have meditated before and they may like it and they may have a regular meditation practice, but when they have a teacher to guide them, they're able to kind of break through certain, kind of false conceptions, or, that judging voice that tells you you're doing it wrong. And having a teacher to guide the classes, I feel, is really transformative for people.
And there's a lot of that's offered for free now,
Right.
too.
For sure.
Like there's a lot of starter places that I and Catherine, we actually cultivate a website that the Mindful Voice Collaborative has all the resources where we kind of vet some of the places that we have found helpful ourselves or other people have told us about and we've looked at, where there are these fabulous resources freely offered for people to learn mindfulness from extremely experienced teachers.
Right.
Yeah. So that's mindfulvoicecollaborative.com/resources.
Yep. Great. Great. Well, if you were going to give our listeners, so we can assume are other voice teachers or singers, right? One thing that they could start with if they already don't have, and I think you alluded to this a little bit, Julia, but if you could tell them one thing they could start with in terms of having a beginning mindfulness practice, what would that be?
Yeah. Okay. So I think there's two ways. I'm going to offer two, unless Catherine wants to jump in and steal my second, but I think she might have a different one. So from an outsider coming in to mindfulness, as a previous singer who had a lot of, so I thought somatic awareness, the loving kindness was a new way in.
Right.
What loving kindness is, for people who, like me, didn't know what that was and were a little weirded out by it, it is basically offering good wishes or thoughts to a loved person, somebody that you don't have a complex relationship with. This could be somebody alive, a puppy dog, a baby, somebody that's just very easy to love, an uncomplicated relationship. And you would say something like, may you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you live with ease. And that's beautiful, and then you can say that for yourself. The same thing for however many minutes. I do this guided. At first I did it guided because, you're like, what do I do? And then you kind of say it for yourself. And for some people, that's really hard. In fact, they can't even really do it. So then you just stick with what's working. Then you say it for a neutral person that like you saw but don't know, like the mailman, you know? And then, or maybe you really, I love my mailman. So maybe somebody that you just saw in a different state at a checkout counter, right? Somebody neutral.
Barista, whatever.
But yeah. And then you would say it for a difficult person. And also not the most difficult person when you first get started, because that can send you down a whole rabbit hole that you don't want to be
Oh,
in.
yeah, for sure.
So, so that's loving kindness in a nutshell. And what I realized, like, you know, when I was in a really tough place, or for singers who are in a world where there is so much competition, so much criticism, internal criticism. I mean, we just sit there and talk about how this didn't go right, that didn't, you know, most people are very self-critical that are at that high level. And the loving kindness is an antidote to that, I find, and opens a window. The other one that I love as a
Can I just add
first,
one thing real quick, Julia?
yes,
In my course, we added extending loving kindness to your voice.
yes, 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 yes.
And that is extremely emotional for anyone who's been critical of their voice or anyone who feels that their voice has let them down in any way. And that brings up often with voice disorder patients a whole conversation around grief. So it's really wonderful.
And I think the relationship with the voice is so important to really view it as a relationship, because it's something that each of us has, but like Catherine said, very few of us have intentionally cultivated that relationship in a positive way. Many of us have unintentionally cultivated it in a negative way. And there's a lot of self-talk towards the voice, whether it's, once again, cognizant or not cognizant. And even just saying those words, this also Catherine alluded to, can really spark feelings. And it might be feelings of overwhelming gratitude. Like, oh my gosh, I have this fabulous gift, you know, that, and it might just be a paradigm shift. So anyway, that, yes, that's huge. And we do that a lot with speaking voice disorders, because a lot of times people are putting a lot of hatred towards their voice. But the self and the voice, there is a very thin line, if one at all,
Mhm.
between self and voice.
Right.
So hating the voice or criticizing the voice comes dangerously close to hating the self, if it's not the same thing.
Right.
So this gets extremely important.
Mhm.
What might seem to be just a beginning opening gateway could be the whole thing, you know, with years of practice. And that's the other thing, is you can do the very same practice. Have any of you seen My Octopus Teacher, or whatever that movie is? It's a guy that goes to the same
Oh,
exact,
octopus. Oh, yeah. It's awesome. It's
yeah,
great.
and the guy goes to the same exact place every day,
Yeah.
and is
My octopus teacher.
Oh, yeah, 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 I've seen it. Yeah.
and the
Dr.
guy goes to the same place in the ocean every single day. And his friends are like, why are you going to the same place every day? There's a whole ocean. And he's like, you would not believe how fascinating it is. Just this one little, because he's following this octopus. And that's kind of how it is with your, you know, the more you go into the meditation, the more fascinating it becomes. So the other one is a body scan. And the reason why I think a body scan is such a good entry way is, first of all, most of us have done it if you're a singer in some form or another. Um, and just concentrating and bringing awareness to any tension that you have, with that added note of not judging it or noticing reactions to it, and sitting still and watching the breath and watching the mind, just that can be transformative and can help. You know, it is a skill.
Mhm.
So the more we develop the skill, the more our tension, which is related to tension in the body, is related to tension in the mind, I believe. The more we become aware of our tension at an earlier stage, so that our tension itself becomes our early warning device.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And I completely agree. I would tell people to start with the body scan. But I agree with Julia. Everyone's going to be different and have a different entry point. For me, I was a singer with pretty low somatic awareness, and so the body scan was just my lifeline. And once I developed the muscle tension dysphonia, it just gave me a tool to be able to relax that. And it's, again, like Julia had said, the idea of mindfulness being a little bit less about the mind and more about the body is often a paradigm shift for people, because we hear mindfulness and we think, so it's mind training or something like that. And yet it really is about, noticing what's happening for you physically. And of course, we're noticing thoughts and emotions as well without necessarily engaging with them, but we're noticing them. But the body, I think, as an entry point, is really great. And there's a reason most of the 8-week courses start with the body scan, because it is often a favorite.
Yeah.
And my body scan on my website spends extra time on the neck and throat, because I basically created the body scan that I wanted when I was diagnosed with my disorder. I wanted something that spent extra time and extra compassion on this area. And I think it's great for singers with fatigue and for anyone who experiences any pain anywhere
And
in the body.
experienced a session where Catherine led a body scan for singers at the PAVA conference, and the first question was, every body scan I've ever done goes from the head to the feet. Why did you start at the feet? And Catherine, you can maybe answer that.
I started the feet because the neck is very emotionally charged for singers and for anyone with a voice disorder. And so I think it's great to kind of practice on a really neutral body part like the feet that we don't have a lot of emotion towards typically. And often people even have trouble even feeling their feet. So it's like a great warm up. And we go up through the legs, through the pelvis, and then by the time we get to the neck, some people have fallen asleep already.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's why I do that. But there's a kind of a debate in the mindfulness world about which way you should start. But I have strong feelings, and my voice disorder patients actually tend to prefer feet to head.
Yeah, I think I do too. I've done it both ways, and I think feet to head is easier for me because by the time I get to my head, I'm finally relaxed and I can like maybe quiet some of those big or loud voices, whatever, whatever's popping that day, down a little bit if I had take the time to kind of relax my body fully. Well, this is great, and we're so grateful that you guys came on, and we hope that our folks will look at your website, and I'm going to go to your website and look for your body scan. And I love a good guided meditation. It's my favorite thing, I think, besides doing my own body scan. I like a good guided meditation, so I'm going to check you out. And we encourage all of our listeners to check you out. We're so grateful for your time today. Toni, you have anything else you want to add?
I'll say two things. One, if you are resonating with their portion of their conversation when they were talking about loving your voice, it reminded me of something in our book. If you want to go back and research, we have the singer's 5 love languages, how to communicate love to your voice through the 5 love languages, a tangible way to express love. And I loved what you had to say about that. And then this is a hard question and not an easy answer, but I can't help but think it's really timely for me to get to chat with you all, because just a few weeks ago, I had the wonderful opportunity of teaching a woman who is highly educated as a singer, highly trained, and had some vocal disorders. And I said, this is a hard question and not an easy answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What appeared to me in the lesson is when she would say, this is broken, this is broken. I said, well, let's explore this. Let's look at this through a different lens. And then she would do something and I'd say, tell me again how that's broken. And she goes, well, that's okay. That was okay. But this is broken. And every time she tried to show me something that was broken because of her label, when we started playing and exploring it and looking at it was something new, it wasn't broken. And I'm not denying that they aren't voice disorders, but how does someone not become their disorder? Are you following my question or what I'm
Yeah,
talking about?
absolutely. And this is something that comes up all the time in my group classes with people with voice disorders, which You can send her to my website,
I've
katherinekbrown.com/courses.
already thought about it.
Sign up. But there becomes this perception that the voice is broken, and yes, you're right. So there is a physiological disorder, and we don't want to deny that. But at the same time, one of my singers who had essential vocal tremor said, and she's a cabaret singer in New York. She's won awards, wonderful singer. She said, "I'm learning to sing with the voice I have, not the voice I had." And so that's the acceptance piece. And when we're constantly, referring to ourselves as broken, there's something we haven't accepted. We're maybe judging really hard, but not accepting. And I think there's a big difference between saying I can accept that I have this voice disorder and I'm going to really judge my voice really hard. Um, when we can accept it for what it is, it gives us a little more freedom to work with the new voice. If we're constantly criticizing it, then we're just focusing on what's wrong. And that's going to add a level of anxiety. That's going to add a level of physical tension. So I think she's missing the non-judgment piece and missing the acceptance piece. And that's something mindfulness could absolutely help with if she's open
And
to.
when Catherine and I talk about, how voice teachers and voice therapists can implement some of these ideas, one of the ways to work with judgmental language, which is what that is, it's broken, right? That because it is objectively a judgment. We can mirror that. Hey, I hear you saying it's broken, but it's hard for me to, that's not really an objective description of your voice. It's more of, how you feel about it or what you think happened. Let's use words that help us to better describe your voice and work with it. So, when you say that word broken, are you talking about strained? Are you talking about tight? Are you talking about raspy? Are you talking about a voice break? Are you talking about, you could go on a list of 15 things. And when they can start to see that, one of the other things they can see, which is a mindfulness exercise as well, is that nothing's ever the same. There's degrees, so one day it might be an 8 type, but the next day maybe it's a 6. So it's still tight. And in her mind, probably, if it were judged, maybe still broken, but it's different. It's not the same. So it does give more room for change when we use non-judgmental language.
Absolutely. And then as a teacher, suddenly you can say, okay, so the issue is that you're cracking on a C, that we can play with, rather than, and like Julia said, maybe you're not cracking every time, you're only cracking in certain situations, at certain volumes, in this one song. That's not a broken issue. That's a technological issue. And sure, it may have something physiological underlying it, but that doesn't mean that, it can't be, rehabilitated.
The other thing it brings to mind is the idea of pain behaviors, which is in the field of pain medicine and pain science. People have pain behaviors when, if they always do something in response to their pain, and it's almost like they don't need to do that anymore. It's a behavior that's associated with their pain. And so maybe that judgment is a pain behavior, but we could call it like a voice behavior. So even just kind of objectifying that and saying, if we might want to categorize, maybe when you hear yourself saying this, we can just put it on a shelf and go, oop, there it is again. That's my old, my voice disorder persona. And we're gonna, it can be there, but we're not gonna feed it.
Right. Right. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Toni, you feel like you got what you wanted there? Yeah.
Very good.
Well,
So
thank you so much for having us on. It's a pleasure.
yeah, so great to meet you both finally. And we will uh send our people who are interested your way and have them look at your website, and we'll put that in the show notes. So thank you so much.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Thanks for listening. Our book, The Mindfulness of Singing, Creating a Harmonious Mind, Body, and Spirit, is available through Amazon.
Please feel free to like, subscribe, and give us some stars. We appreciate your support. See you next time.